I believe that critical thinking nowadays is especially important because the great amount of information is created daily, and in order to sort it, filter and analyze, and actually to distinguish the parts of it which are going to form our outlook, we need this critical thinking.
Critical thinking definitely is important. I mean, emotions makes us human, it makes us who we are, it gives us great moments in life, but when it comes to relying on information of any sort, logic is the most important factor, and emotions have to get out of the way.
I've got a question about critical thinking. How can we train ourselves to be critical thinkers? Like, is it only by reading books? Or do we need to go into debate with each other? Or is it everything at its whole?
Critical thinking seems to be very important. Everyone is talking about it. But what do people mean when they say critical thinking? And like one of the youngsters asks, how can we do this and train ourselves to think critically? Let's find out.
Critical thinking is not something that's easy to define. I guess it's fair from a historical point of view to say that it started with the Greeks in Athens, 5th century before Christ, with somebody like Socrates. Everybody knows Socrates. And mainly what Socrates did was asking people questions like, how do you define this? How do you know this? What is your argument? Isn't there a contradiction in what you're saying? And is it correct from a factual point of view? And doesn't it lead to bizarre consequences and so on? So what Socrates did basically is critical thinking in action, so to speak. So it started with Socrates, I think we can say, in the Western tradition. But what we realize is that it's not something that comes naturally. It takes a lot of effort. So we are now 2,500 years later, but people are not born with critical thinking skills. It's not a natural thing to become a critical thinker. So you have to learn it. You have to. Somebody needs to teach you the skills. You have to read books. It's a hard job. Also, it's not something that you learn in a course that takes a week or so. Now, many people seem to think that they do think critically, which is interesting, because it's also very obvious that this cannot be true. For instance, let me give a radical example here. There's people who think that the Earth is flat. They're called the flat earthers. Now, I guess it's fair to say that most people will agree they are wrong. Earth is not flat, Earth is more or less round. We have lots and lots of evidence to prove that the Earth is round. Nevertheless, these people do believe, oh no, this is all wrong. Science has it wrong, the observations are wrong, the measurements are wrong, and so on. They don't know what they're talking about. We know the Earth is flat, and we, the flat earthers, are the true critical thinkers. We are so critical that we refuse to accept what the scientific consensus is about the form of the Earth. So they're convinced, that's my point here, that what they do is much more in line with what critical thinking is than what uncountable scientists are saying and measuring and so on. So that also makes clear that it's not an easy thing to define when even flat earthers believe that they are the true critical thinkers. That shows it's not an easy thing.
Critical thinking is rather complex and not easy to define. Are there any tips and tricks we can keep in mind when we talk about critical thinking?
I think it's a good idea to come up with a few rules of thumb, so to speak, about what critical thinking is. And maybe one of the most important ones is that for extraordinary claims, you need extraordinary proof. That's a famous skeptical, critical thinking one-liner, so to speak. So the more radical your claim is, the more heavyweight, so to speak, your proof and your arguments must be. So the question is here, what does it mean to say I need extraordinary proof? What is an extraordinary proof, right? That's a very important problem. That's something you should always ask yourself and other people, what is your proof and what is the quality of that proof? How extraordinary is it? But before that, we must be able to estimate what an extraordinary claim is. When is something extraordinary? Right? Now, my rule of thumb there, my intake is, it's a metaphor in a sense, that you can think about the best knowledge that we have as if we're talking about a crossword puzzle. Everybody knows what a crossword puzzle is. We've all had the frustrating experience that you came up with a word that you figured out for something, A7, horizontal or whatever, and you know this has to be the right word. It's 15 letters, it fits the description, this is correct. But then after a while you see, well, something's wrong. It doesn't fit with the other words that are figured out in the crossword puzzle. Okay? So what can you do? I think you can stick to your first opinion, although it is contradicted with all the other words you're filling in the crossword puzzle, or you have to agree that you made a mistake, right? And you get rid of the first word and you try to come up with something else. Now, the more words you find, the stronger your answers become. Why? Because they support each other, right? If you have one word and it fits with other words with the same letters, then you know that the odds become better to be correct with the words. You see the point here. Now, another rule of thumb, so to speak, to think about what critical thinking is to think about what the consequences would be if you would be correct. So if we do the math, so to speak, are we willing to do that, or would it be a smart thing to do that? Just saying, I believe this has to be true, this alternative medicine needs to work, and the price I'm paying for this is that almost everything in chemistry and toxicology and so on, we need to get rid of that. We need to rewrite everything we know in these fields. Is that a good balance? I don't think so. So if the consequences of what you believe, when they lead to such extreme things, you need to be very skeptical about your own beliefs. I will never say that it's impossible. You could be right, but you'll have to come up with very, very, very strong evidence, right? So these are a few aspects of what it means to be a critical thinker. Obviously, it also has to do with your personal psychology. Like, you have to be willing to reconsider your own opinions. See? Someone who tells you, well, no matter what you say, I stick to my opinion, this will always be true, even if all the evidence in the whole universe goes against my opinion, I will still believe it, and so on. That's not a critical thinker, that's a dogmatic thinker, right? So you need to be willing to give up your own beliefs, right? Even if you normally will defend them very strongly. But you never know.
We now know what critical thinking is and received some good tips and examples that explain the complexity of critical thinking. But how come that even smart people sometimes aren't real critical thinkers? And why is it so easy to deceive us? We'll talk about it in the next video.